Holy Gospel according to Luke. Glory to you, O Lord. Jesus entered Jericho and was passing through it. A man was there named Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector and was rich. He was trying to see who Jesus was, but on account of the crowd, he could not, because he was short in stature. So he ran ahead and climbed a sycamore tree to see Jesus because he was going to pass that way. When Jesus came to the place, he looked up and said to him, "Zacchaeus, hurry and come down, for I must stay at your house today." So he hurried down and was happy to welcome him. All who saw it began to grumble and said, "He has gone to be the guest of one who is a sinner." Zacchaeus stood there and said to the Lord, "Look, half of my possessions, Lord, I will give to the poor. And if I have defrauded anyone anything, I will pay back 4 times as much." Then Jesus said to him, "Today salvation has come to this house, because he too is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek out and save the lost." This is the gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, O Christ. Please be seated. Grace and peace to you on this day from God, our Father, and our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. Amen. So it was 1980-something. I think I was about 8 years old. I was 8 or 9. Don't remember the exact date. But my family had moved. This was not traumatic because we moved 4 houses down the street. We moved from a 3-bedroom house to a 4-bedroom house, from one fire hydrant to the next fire hydrant. On my parents' first house, it was a raised ranch. Both of them are raised ranches. The deck was on the back, and because of the way the house is built, that means the deck was off of the ground. And the poles came down in the back. There was just gravel underneath it, but there were, of course, those cement footings for the poles to go into. So when I was a small child, my friends and I would play fireman by hanging off of the pole. We also would play garbage man, because the garbage truck would come on Monday morning, and it was a 2-person job. There was a driver up front, and then there was the guy that hung off the back, who I thought was the coolest guy in the world, who could then pick up the garbage and throw it into the compactor. Sometimes it wouldn't even stop. It was that impressive. I just thought, this is really cool. So you all know I've already gotten into firefighting. If I get into sanitation, I'll let you know. At my parents' second house, they still live in this house, there was a tree in the backyard. I'd love to tell you it was a sycamore tree, but it was not. It was a maple tree. Again, I was about 8 years old, and for the next several years, probably till almost high school, if it was a nice day out, I was up in that tree. Especially when I was really little, or little-ish, it required some good effort to get into the tree because I wasn't quite tall enough. So I would run towards the tree. And there was a little groove, a little notch in it where I could quick get my foot and reach my arm up and hoist myself up while I had all the momentum going and flip around onto the lowest big branch. Then it was pretty easy because most of the branches were close together. And then there was always kind of a perch where I would go, and I could sit there for hours. I just loved it. I could look down at the deck. I could look across to my neighbor. They had a basketball hoop in the backyard. So good job with the basketball today. See if anybody of my neighbors were playing basketball. There was also a school behind my parents' backyard on the other side of a creek. I could see if there was anything going on there. But mostly what I was doing is I was just losing myself, letting my imagination run wild. I wouldn't have said it then, but I would say it now. It was also a place where I would be praying. That's what I was doing up there. And I did this for years. All until one day when I got to be a little bit bigger, and I climbed up the tree, and I got to my spot, and the wind started to go a little bit, and I heard a crack. And I thought, this might be the last time I climb this tree. And it was. A couple of years ago, the whole tree had to come down. So that was the last time I was in that tree. Now sometimes, though, I would be sitting up in that tree, and I would know that it was time to come down because I either had to go someplace or it was dinner time or something along those lines. But most of the time it would require somebody saying to me, like my mother, "Geoff, come down from the tree. It's time for dinner." What's amazing about this story about Zacchaeus is not just that he's a short little guy. It's not just that he is up in the tree. It's not just that he's away from everybody else. It takes Jesus calling his name for him to come out. Now, why Jesus knew Zacchaeus' name, I have no idea. Maybe he had a reputation and it preceded him. Maybe maybe he had heard some people talking about him as he approached Jericho. After all, remember last week, Jesus healed the blind man right outside of the town. Who knows? Maybe he was looking for him. After all, Jesus says, "I came to seek the lost." Now, something also that I think is really fascinating about Zacchaeus. So, I had read this book a couple of years ago. It's written by a woman named Diana Butler Bass. She's a theologian. She has this whole book on gratitude and being grateful. And of course, we're getting close to giving thanks, being that time of year. She has a whole chapter on Zacchaeus. One of the things she talked about is not that Zacchaeus was so short that why he was up in the tree. Maybe he was up in the tree because he thought he was better than everybody else, because here's a person that knew how to climb. To be a tax collector in those days, as we've talked about before, meant that you had to buy your position from Rome, which he would have had to do. And then to make a living as a tax collector, you would collect more than what was owed to the empire, and that was your income. And as Luke tells us, Zacchaeus is a chief tax collector. Now, I remember looking that up a few years ago. There was no such thing as a chief tax collector, so he was really good at that. Luke tells us that he was quite wealthy, that he was rich. He would have been someone that people thought was dishonest and crooked, a traitor, all of those things. He would have known how to wheel and deal. He would have known how to get the things that he wanted. He would have known how to work his way up the social ladder. There he is, up in the tree, better than everybody else, so he could see. But maybe he's also up in the tree because nobody liked him, right? He's up there. Can you imagine all these people standing around, waiting for a parade? Jesus is coming and you have to stand next to that loser? No way. So, in any case, he's up in that tree. And Jesus sees him and calls him down. Zacchaeus, I'm coming to your house today. Now, another thing Bass points out in her little story about Zacchaeus is because Zacchaeus was a wheeler and dealer, he wasn't working with people that were at the same level than him. He was always trying to get ahead or trying to get something from somebody else. And what does Jesus do? He calls him and they stand on the same level. And then also, because Zacchaeus would have been known how to wheel and deal, he would have known how to get things from people or expect favors in return or trade this for that. Jesus kind of takes the wind out of that as well and invites himself over. I'm coming to your house. And Zacchaeus has this amazing moment of transformation. I will give back half to the poor. And if I have taken anything from anybody dishonestly, I will give back 4 times as much. Now, how did Zacchaeus get all of his money? It's all crooked money, right? This is not an accounting story, because he could never pay back 4 times of what he had taken if he had taken it all. This is a story about his transformation of what happens when Jesus calls your name, calls you out of the tree, and offers you a new life. What tree are you in? So a number of years ago, when I was in another congregation, there was this guy who was very charismatic. He knew how to get things done. He was a good leader, actually. He was part of all kinds of things at the church. He knew how to make things happen. Except he also had this other side to him where if somebody told him no, he'd still do it anyway. He'd just find another back channel to make sure that he got his way. And in a sense, he kind of didn't really worry about who he ran over in the process to make that happen. Although deep down, what I think he really just wanted was everybody to like him. He was a bit abrasive at times. That wasn't until something horrible happened in his family because his son had died. His son was about my age, maybe a couple of years older. And even though he had been part of the church his whole life, had been involved in church his whole life, had been in leadership a good chunk of his life in church, maybe he missed it or maybe he didn't experience it in the same way, but in that moment, something happened. He came down from the tree because that congregation loved him, and they loved his family, and they loved him through that moment, and those weeks and months and years, and it softened him. Now, he still had an agenda. He still wanted things to get done. But I could say in the time that followed that he became an ally and a champion and even a friend in those years. Jesus invited him out of that tree, and he loved him. A few years ago when we were in Canaan, there was a woman who was there who I can best describe in the nicest and kindest way as my nemesis. If I was oil, she was water on just about everything. We disagreed on approach or what was important. I remember once I had this sermon on don't sweat the small stuff, and then I got yelled at for the details I missed afterwards. This was the relationship that we had. One of her issues, I think, is that she didn't quite know how to open herself up. And she would quite literally lock herself in the church for hours on some nights, and you just see her car there and wonder what was going on. It all came to a head, I think, for me, when there was another death that had happened. There was this family who was just walking down the street. They had just been out to lunch. They weren't quite sure what to do. They had had a death in the family. And they saw the church, and they knocked on the door. They went in, and they thought to themselves, maybe these people can help us. So we had the arrangements. We had the funeral there. We surrounded that family just like we do here. And then some things happened. They started participating in the life of the congregation. They didn't join as members ever, but they would come to worship every once in a while. They would sit kind of in the back. They would greet and talk with people afterwards. The then new matriarch of that family, she worked for a flower shop and nursery, so every once in a while she would just kind of like bring extra stuff. So it was shortly afterwards, it was maybe not quite this time of year, but it was the fall. When it came to be around Thanksgiving time, all of a sudden these big hay bales showed up and lots of pumpkins and cornucopias and gourds and Indian corn and you name it. It was out there, just this beautiful display, just kind of came from, seemed like nowhere, just out of her generosity, out of her gratitude for being connected. And this happened over the course of a whole nother year. It'd be spring, there'd be new flowers. In the summer, there was stuff. It came time, it was getting to be the following spring, I think, but she came to plant some flowers, some plants, in honor of her mother. And of course, my nemesis was in charge of the garden. It did not go well. To make a long story short, my nemesis had unearthed these flowers because they didn't, quote, belong there. And it didn't matter what I said or how apologetic I was to this family. That was it. We didn't see them anymore after that. They were gone. And later on, it might have been another year or so, I went to this conference, and who was the speaker but this Diana Butler Bass from this book that I was telling you about. And she was sharing with the pastors of our New England Synod and other rostered leaders, just stories of gratitude, her own faith. She was actually working on this project at the time, I believe. And I had a moment to talk to her, and I sat next to her, and I told her this story of this family that had come to this church who weren't members, they weren't even church people, but somehow they got connected because people loved them and they experienced that love of God in Christ that we all know about when he calls our name. And what had happened with this encounter with, for lack of better terms, my nemesis. And I'll never forget what she said to me. She looked me right in the eye and right in that moment, and she said, "You know what? Sometimes people aren't quite ready to come out of the tree yet." What tree are you in? What place holds you away from each other? Away from those who love you? Away from those you rub the wrong way? Away from the places where all of us can be part of this amazing grace that surrounds us. Today, Jesus offers us in this story a moment to remember that he calls each and every one of us by name, to come down out of that tree. And all he's looking for is absolute transformation. But it starts with one place: love.